still lives. I want to hear her scream.
I am one of the chosen. I can grant your every wish.
Can you restore the balance?
Darksiders is an action-adventure game that weaves its narrative over its depiction of the apocalypse. It stars War, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, framed for jump-starting the war between angels and demons and breaking the balance. Seeking to redeem himself, he sets off on a quest to find out who is ultimately responsible and regain his powers lost in the battle to keep peace between both angels and demons. Kicking off the new year, Darksiders seems to be one of the first leaders of a slew of action games to be released within the next few months. But can it compete with the big-name games like Bayonetta and God of War 3? The story's dynamic is much the same of many other games of its genre, but its setting helps differentiate it and keep the player's interest. War's a bit void of personality. He fits the bill of an anti-hero perfectly. While not being quite as cold-hearted as Kratos from the God of War series, he shows little compassion to friends and enemies alike, seeking only retribution and redemption above all else. Darksiders starts off as a fairly linear action game, with the occasional puzzle and platforming elements. The combat is very shallow at the start of the game, and the same few enemies fill each room. However, after the first few hours you come across your first dungeon, similar very much in nature to the Legend of Zelda series. Each dungeon has keys, puzzles, and a new item to delve deeper into the dungeon. At the end of each dungeon are well-designed bosses that usually require a certain degree of strategy as well as combat reflexes in order to best. Boss fights are usually grand in scale and are the game's biggest highlight, and dungeons are very well crafted. While all the puzzle components definitely harken back to the Legend of Zelda series, the game's jumping and combat mechanics allow it to play out very differently, and gives it its own spin. Outside of dungeons, the game reverts back to a linear combat-driven game. Even with the introduction of new items at a rapid pace, the game still struggles to stay fresh in this regard. There's a very limited amount of maneuvers and combos, and the controls are not solid enough to give you much satisfaction when facing enemies. War's combat style is much better suited for fighting enemies one-on-one, but enemies will horde around you at every turn. It's not all that difficult because the game gives you an abundance of health, but you never really feel like you're all that in control of battle. The dodge and block mechanics simply don't work as they should. As a whole, the controls are fairly cumbersome. Even after playing through for several hours, it's easy to fumble around when you're trying to use magic, guarding, or dashing. Too much of the game is mapped to the shoulder buttons, and you'll sometimes want to use both of the either left or right triggers at the same time, which simply doesn't work. There are a few purchasable combos, but they're never really more effective than those that the game gives you with to begin with. The game does offer a scythe as an optional purchasable weapon, and it's a good idea to invest in it as soon as possible. It allows for some much needed crowd control, and it adds a small bit of depth to the shallow combat. Also to note, War moves far too slowly, especially since the game will have you traverse long distances when you're on your way to the next dungeon. It's hard to give a definitive opinion on the game's pacing. The game does try to keep itself fairly unique with airborne combat segments and a few temporary use heavy fire weapons, but these segments are poorly done and oftentimes last much too long. Occasionally, the game will artificially increase its length by subjecting the player to do 4 or 5 combat challenges called Shadow Arenas to progress. They can be fun sometimes, but ultimately prove burdensome. Halfway through the game you gain access to War's trusted steed, Ruin. Ruin is actually well designed, and far outranks Epona in terms of usefulness. It would have seemed smart to introduce Ruin much earlier in the game, as he adds a lot to the game, and is very well integrated into combat and travel. Graphically, the game is decent. The comic book art style and cool special effects are definitely noteworthy, but the poor textures and awkward graphical mishaps do bring it down. It certainly isn't a graphical masterpiece, but each environment does a good job of creating a whole new look and feel, and it certainly has a lot of character. The music is pretty standard affair, but very fitting as well. It's unlikely that you'll be purchasing the soundtrack off of iTunes, but it does a good job of conveying each area's mood and feel. It may sound as though the game is overly flawed to be worth playing, but while lackluster, the combat still does offer some fun. The game does try new things which can be fun to play around with, and the dungeons and bosses are really incredible. If you're looking for an action game fix, for now it may be more worthy to invest in Bayonetta, which is released on the same day. But if you're a big fan of Zelda games and craving more than just the Nintendo DS releases, Darksiders is definitely worth your money. It's a good first outing for Vigil Games, and is an enjoyable experience, no doubt.